This next multi-choice question looks at port security, which is one of the trickier things to troubleshoot, particularly due to the default settings that you need to remember. So let's take a look. This particular question has the usual stem and answers and figure, plus an exhibit. So you might want to hit pause here to read through, and then take a few moments over here with the exhibit that shows configuration on 4 different interfaces on the switch that you saw in the figure. As usual, you can stop now and answer if you prefer, before seeing the number of correct answers, if you just like to make it a little more difficult. Now you've seen the number of correct answers, which is what the exam would be like. You can hit pause again and back up and look at the question and exhibits and make your own answer. And finally, I'll give you a little bit of analysis about the question itself and give you one more chance to stop if you like. So what does the question stem really tell us in this case? It has some connective words, and it talks about the configuration being saved and the switch is reloaded. Now, a lot of questions wouldn't mention something like that. So why is it mentioned here? Well, it turns out with port security, it can change interfaces to a weird state called error disabled. I say weird in that you don't see it much, particularly at CCNA level. And one of the ways that a switch can recover an interface from that state is for the user to do a shutdown and no shutdown command on the interface. Well, you can also recover from that by simply reloading the switch. In a production network, obviously that's pretty extreme, but for this question, it's basically the way of saying, all right, we're going to start anew, all the interfaces should be up and up, and then it goes on to say in that next highlighted phrase, we're talking about the first frame to enter the switch after the reload. So we've set up the scenario, or the stem has set up the scenario to mean all the interfaces should be up. They should not be brought into this error disabled state by port security. And the first frame that comes in, that's the one we're considering for each of these answers. So which of these answers would cause a change in the interface state to error disabled, implied by the fact that we're talking about port security in the exhibit, based on the details in the answers. So that's basically what the question is driving at. Last chance to pause and answer on your own. So let's take a look at the details. First off, all 4 interfaces have port security configuration in the first 2 subcommands that enables port security on the interface. Those lines are highlighted. So each of the 4 interfaces have the commands switch port mode access and switch port security. Switch port mode access is important because for port security to be enabled, the port must be statically configured either as an access port or a trunk port. So we could have had switch port mode trunk or switch port mode access, one of the two, but it could not have been switch port mode dynamic something, right? So we had to get away from the default that would use a dynamic mode to explicitly configure access mode in this case. Then the switch port security command enables switch port security. In effect, all 4 interfaces truly have port security configured, and at that point, if no other configuration existed, the interfaces would be working with all default port security configuration. As you can see, there's different configuration on each of the 4 interfaces, which makes the answers require that you analyze the configuration and then the combination of that configuration with the defaults in each of the 4 cases. And that's what we'll do for the next few moments to round out this question. So let's take a look at answer C to begin, because oddly enough, that's the one that gets to a core feature of port security that doesn't take much examination of the configuration. Think about what answer C says. A frame that's sent by host 3, and the arrow line shows the frame coming in from host 3, and it's going to host 4, and the answer says changes G0/4's state. Now the frame's coming in G0/3, and it goes out G0/4, and it's asking about a state change to G0/4. It turns out that does not trigger port security logic on interface G04. Port security logic works for incoming frames on an interface. So this frame is going to come in G03 and out G04. It would only possibly cause an interface state change on G03. So we can rule out answer C because of the direction of frame and the interface mentioned. Don't even have to look at the configuration. The other 3, if you look at their details, all mention a frame that comes in the same interface that's mentioned in the answer, so we do have to look at the configuration. So let's look at answer A that talks about a frame sent from host 1 to host 2 coming in G01, so G01's interface state might change. So there's the frame coming in the figure, and on the right, I've repeated the exhibit information about that interface from earlier in this example. So the source MAC address of host 1 per the figure is that 0200.1111111 MAC address that you see there. Remember, port security looks at the source MAC address to make its decision of what violates the port security rules. Now, it says there on the screen now that there's only one MAC allowed. Well, that's a default setting. The maximum number of MACs is not defined on the right, so it defaults to 1. And the specific MAC that's defined is 0200.222.2222, which is indeed specifically defined on the right. Translated, we allow only one, we've defined it, but it's not the source MAC of the frame. So a violation has indeed occurred. However, notice the violation mode is set to restrict. And in violation mode restrict, the switch does not change the interface state to error disabled. It leaves it as up. That last bit is something that a lot of people forget to think about or forget the details once you've read over it and moved on to other things. So we'll review that in just a moment. But in this case, answer A is incorrect because G01 state remains the same. The frame would be discarded, but the interface state remains the same. So to review those port security violation modes, there are 3 of them: protect, restrict, and shutdown. As you see in the bottom row, only the shutdown violation mode actually error disables the port. Restrict and protect modes do not. All right, so we've ruled out 2 answers. Let's take a look at answer B, repeating the exhibit on the right and showing the frame coming in from host 2 in the figure. So a frame sent by host 2 to host 3 changes G02 state. Is that true? Well, the source MAC of that frame is 0200.222.2222. Port security looks at the source MAC to make its decision. 1 MAC is allowed. Why? That's a default. Notice the config does not set the maximum number of MACs. Are there any MACs defined? No. We've defined this as MAC address sticky, meaning that the first MAC learned on this port will be added to the configuration. So no violation occurs. We've got space for 1 more MAC to be learned. It'll be this particular MAC. So the 0200 all 2's MAC address would be added to the configuration. So this one is not true because G02 state does not change. So we've ruled out 3 of the 4 answers, so we know that the last answer is correct, so we've already got a check mark beside it. But this is the one for which the frame enters the G04 interface. There's the configuration on G04. So to tell you why it's correct, the source MAC of the frame ends in all 4s. The configuration defaults to only 1 MAC allowed. It predefines the MAC is 0200 in all 3s. Violation occurs, but it also defaults to port security mode shutdown. And because of the mode being shut down, the port is changed to an error disabled state. So that's the analysis of the 4 answers, and here's a summary of those for your reference.